everyone. My name is Usibusiso Sitole. I'm an architect from Durban, originally from a small township in the south coast called Ekamalaki. That's where I hail from. And yeah, today I'm going to be talking about social housing, the social constructs and its construction. South Africa is quite interesting and different because of its historical past. I think many people are aware that South Africa was subjected to a system called apartheid. Well, apartheid was a system of segregation where through the Group Areas Act, people were forcefully removed and relocated and separated into homelands and certain areas outside the CBD. And certain areas were reserved only for the white dominant race. So coloreds, Indians, and blacks were actually relocated to their own homelands where they were supposed to govern themselves. But through the through the apartheid system, certain measures were actually introduced, hindering their growth, and therefore restricting their development. So this is the kind of system that we hail from, and the system actually started in 1950s after the adoption of the Group Areas Act law, and it lasted for 54 years up until the dawn of democracy in 1994, where a democratically elected government was inaugurated. The national government was actually voted into power in 1948, and then that whole campaign was about actually developing South Africa and prioritizing the white race. That was the whole campaign. Hence, 2 years later, a legislation was passed, a planning legislation, which actually reshaped the whole landscape of South Africa, not just the physical landscape, but so every single aspect of South Africa, social, economic, and cultural. So essentially, apartheid was planning legislation, which actually it was the underlying basis of the whole regime. Okay. So post 1994, government tried to bring in policies which were actually meant to kind of address these social injustices. By a notable scheme, especially in the built environment, was the RDP, the Reconstruction and Development Plan, where the government's aim was to provide better service delivery to previously disadvantaged South Africa. And the aim was to replace shacks within the township and urban areas and giving lower income groups a better life, a life of opportunities and dignity. Essentially, this RTP, I think many people actually misconceive this as the RTP is just a housing policy. Well, the RTP was actually much more bigger than a housing policy. It was actually meant to address education, healthcare. It was meant to give services, mainly all the services that were previously ignored from the township, like schools and everything. But because housing delivery was the shortfall and housing delivery was the immediate thing that actually lots of the community and impact could actually see physically, then you find those houses, because they were under the RTP scheme, they were actually labeled as RTP houses. Okay, basically to qualify for RTP house, I'm going to be focusing more on the housing component because the whole topic is about housing. Okay. Well, essentially to be able to qualify for an RTP subsidy, you had to be a South African citizen with a combined household income of less than 3,500 Rand and over the ages of 21 and have a sound mental capacity to sign contracts. First-time government subsidy recipients. So, but the issue about this as well, which you have to note, is that this 3,500 Rand hasn't changed for the past couple of 2 or so decades, since 1994. So even though cost of living and inflation has gone up, this median has remained the same. The RTP typology, I think because it was at its infancy and it was an address of a needed social problem, which is housing. There was a huge shortfall of housing because, as you well know, most cities, current cities, are experiencing large streams of urban migration, a real urban migration. So you find that people were in search of better economic opportunities. So therefore, there was more of a strain for people to attain housing, because housing is actually a basic human right enshrined in the Bill of Rights in South Africa. Access to housing, basic housing. Now, the issue about that is that initially the housing subsidy was a lot lower than what it is now, and over time it obviously has increased to actually accommodate. So the initial housings, RTP houses, were only one room, little, actually a single room with maybe an attached toilet. That was the initial kind of first phases, especially you see those in some of the older townships like Kwamashu, older townships, maybe a little bit in some townships in Mlazi and all those kind of things. So which has actually evolved into more of a 2-bedroom unit with a lounge and a kitchen now. And the basic standard is usually tiles, you know. The reason why people associated with that, because as mentioned earlier, that was under that scheme. So because the government was providing houses under the RTP kind of policy, people now suddenly said, oh, these are RTP houses. And then over time, just the type of houses, government subsidized houses just became RTP houses, even though the scheme or the policy has been superseded by later policies. Okay, and another thing too is that the government also over time actually evolved from just the Department of Housing to Department of Human Settlements to better encapsulate all the other services which actually go into building better environments for the community. So now human settlements no longer, housing or previously, human settlements or previously housing no longer just focuses on houses. It focuses on sometimes service delivery, bulk earthworks, sometimes schools, sometimes community halls, sometimes everything that has the ability to make the human life better in the community. So I think that's why they actually even changed its wording or changed its directive to actually provide a more holistic social service delivery. Well, South Africa is actually also quite a tricky place, or quite an interesting place, by the fact that it's actually got a good banking and financial system. But in saying that, is that there's a large area or part of society which is actually forgotten, or which is actually precluded from the formal economic and banking system. Since if you have a poor credit record or don't have a bank track record, or you high household debt, low income bracket, or you have lots of responsibilities, you do not qualify for the normal bond or loan from the banking institution. And another thing too, which is actually quite a hindrance to South Africa, is that banks do not finance land parcels. You see, they only finance the building structure. And banks do not finance land in rural areas or under Ingonyama Trust, or as per the KZN, what we subjected to under rural land at KZN. So therefore, you find that most people have the ability to build their own houses because they don't have land tenure. They can't get any assistance from the bank. They don't own the land, and that's why you find that people actually, to get closer to the economic activities, people actually end up squatting. So they don't have to spend time, money, and resources to getting to and from their places of work. So hence, our issue of informal settlements actually stems from that, our inability to actually fund and subsidize lower income streams. Now, another different or interesting part about that is that South Africa has a middle missing income bracket. Find that the government is actually focusing on the bottom echelons of society, that cap bracket, 2,500 and below, and the banks finance you from 24,000 Rand up for a residential property. So from 3,500 to 23.990 or 99990, you're quite stuck because you're not rich enough or not wealthy enough to get a bond, but you're not poor enough to be eligible for an RTP. So I think that's where the gap for social housing comes in. That's where to address the housing needs of the missing middle income. Going back to human settlements, basically the mandate of human settlements was to facilitate the development and integration of human settlements by upgrading informal settlements, of providing affordable rental housing income, and providing affordable housing finance. That's now you start seeing the shift from just the provision of free houses to actually facilitating housing for the missing middle income as well. Another kind of acute problem to South Africa is the wide inequality gap that persists in the country. The inequality gap is actually exacerbated by that missing income, which is not being catered for, because you find that there's informal people or informal settlements being developed, and the bank is actually subsidizing or giving loans and bonds to people with the threshold of 24,000 rand and up. So you find that the normal middle income guy can't afford a house and next to his place of employment. That's why you find that there's no development in the township areas. Because why? Also, there seems to be some misconception with the banking system saying that township areas are not viable and are not viable places to actually invest. I think slowly but surely it's starting to change now. With more and more people actually, private sector actually investing in the townships through malls and other businesses. And now people will find that the normal guy who would actually stay in a township is actually reluctant now to move into an urban area because more and more services are being provided in his community. And the banks are actually starting to latch onto that now and actually subsidizing land and parcels within the township area, which is actually starting to address slightly that middle income bracket. So I think that's quite interesting to find out. So basically going back to social housing, I think that's where social housing has the ability to actually make the most impact, because you find that people have the ability to pay over time whatever housing or structure or development that is being provided for them, but they don't have the financial means to actually purchase the land if they're a first-time buyer, or they don't fit within the upper echelon of what their banks require. So now, if government would come in or to say, hey, let's subsidize you're working, have a full-time job, but we'll let you buy the house, and then maybe we'll guarantee the loan against the bank. So suddenly, it starts to shift the whole dynamics of where everything's going, because now the banks will be willing to give you money because obviously the return on the money is actually guaranteed back. And because you've got a physical structure as well, which someone can actually always sell, it starts to shift the whole economic background, because you can actually loan against that physical structure to start a business, to send kids to school, to do whatever, So I think that's where we need to actually start looking at it, because social housing is not just about the physical entity, it starts with the policy. The policies, we have to get the policies right, and we have to change the way we look at housing delivery in South Africa. Another thing, kind of unfortunate thing about South Africa is that because of legislation and the tiers, the income tiers for social housing, is that because it's capped at a certain level, the cap is usually averages from about 168,000. The cap is usually from, depending on the area and the different provinces, it's usually 123,829 rand. And in some areas, it can go up to 183,856. So basically, that's the cap that you have. That money, in most cases, is not enough to actually provide a suitable housing typology in an urban area, because lots of the challenges find that there's challenges with terrain, There's challenges that these areas are actually far away from the main central business node and far away from a bulk infrastructure. It's usually reclaimed land, reclaimed farms, or usually on the periphery. So you find that in most cases it's actually on undesirable land if it's going to be closer to the economic zones. It's actually on undesirable land. So you find that landscaping, the bulk earthworks, platforming, access to those sites, it actually becomes such a challenge that it actually bulks up the cost a little bit. Because of the government's approach that one person, one plot, one house, it actually defeats the purpose. Whereas if you can actually combine all those houses together and provide multi-story or multi-level buildings, might actually provide a better response or a better allowance or better allocation of those funds, because obviously you're building on one piece of land and you're building up. So you're maximizing on the piece of land and you can actually build closer. That's where I say it has to start with policy, because now we have to start shifting the way we look at housing, because I think the bad or kind of a big hindrance to why it would be so difficult to eradicate informal settlements or slums is because the main driver of people building informal settlements is to get closer to their places of work. Whereas vacant lands in South Africa are usually on the periphery, far away, or in the townships, which actually exacerbates that whole latent apartheid planning. So we're trying to resolve the problem, but it's no use placing someone who gets paid the least, placing them far away. They have to take 2 taxis or 3 taxis just to get to their place of work. And you find that most of that income that they're actually gaining actually goes into transportation, which I won't go into other social kind of dilemmas or other social negatives which actually stem from that, where a mother has to wake up at 4 o'clock just to get to work at 8, and come back only at 8 o'clock in the evening. They're tired, they don't see their families, they don't watch their kids grow. So that's why you find that informal settlements or in settlements where predominantly black people in townships, you find that there's other social mishaps which are happening because of the lack of appropriate housing. Okay, but that's another topic for another day. So I think that's why you find that people would be allocated an RTP house on the township or in the periphery, and then after a month or 2, they'll come back to their old shack. Because why? They're spending most of their money on transportation. I think another interesting where government now, or human settlements, is starting to toy with is upgrading of inner city buildings, dilapidated inner city buildings or old unused office block, where they're actually refurbishing them and repurposing them into putting affordable houses. I think that, for me, is a much better approach and a much better form of service delivery, because why? You're putting people where their jobs are, you're putting people where the money is, you're putting people where their place of employment is. So, and you're actually putting life back into the city, because most of these buildings are derelict, dead, and uncatered for. So now you're injecting a new life, because the physical structure is there, the structural structure is there. Now it's just a matter of repurposing them and changing its use, which I think is starting to inject a different form of life and a different form of energy into the city. Most of these buildings are still owned by people. So there's a lengthy legal process which needs to be kind of followed in order for maybe a city or government entity to acquire that building and to change its use into its appropriate use. Sometimes the planning phase, because it's zoned as an office building or a commercial building, the planning process actually takes a little bit of time to actually change it to now from an office building or a commercial building to now a residential building. And all those legal aspects actually take time. And you find that because of the land value in inner cities, these buildings or these parcels that these buildings are on actually cost quite a lot of money, So you find that once you find that the owner, that the government wants to buy the building, they hyperinflate the prices and it doesn't become feasible anymore. So another option was, especially the Tewini municipality, what their approach was, they're actually starting to summon people who were not taking care of the building, shutting down buildings which were not up to health and safety standards, and actually giving them warnings. If they don't fix it up, they actually take those buildings away, because most of the time those buildings actually owe a whole lot of rates to the municipality. So they would expropriate those buildings actually to build social housing schemes. So it's not as easy as one would like it to be, because of just the legal and aspects that one needs to comply with in order to achieve that kind of situation. But you find that private developers, though, are actually doing it quite well, where you find that people like private development companies like Homey and Perpetuity back in the day were actually repurposing these buildings and actually making them into affordable units, affordable rental units for that middle income bracket. Because people have got the ability to rent, or sometimes rent to buy. That's another scheme which the government can actually utilize in order to provide adequate houses for people. A rent to buy system where someone doesn't have that initial collateral, but they can afford to pay that 4,000 Rand every month, 3,500 Rand every month for the next 15 years or so, 10, 15 years, 20 years, however it longs, until they actually own that piece of land. So actually elevating or getting those people out of a certain, because now they've got a collateral and they've got a physical entity that can actually hold and use collateral, and when they're actually utilizing or asking for other services or bonds from other people. Okay, let's move back to townships and providing social houses in townships and informal settlements. Another study which was actually undertaken, I think it was maybe the CSIR or Department of Human Settlements quite some time ago, is that people actually have the ability to build their own buildings, especially in the outskirts townships. Because someone migrates and builds into an informal settlement, no one would want to over-invest into a piece of land they don't own. But you find that as soon as you give someone tenure, they'll start small. They might start with a 2-room, they might add, as more family members actually gain financial independence, they actually help to contribute into making a more livable housing unit. So people do have the ability to build for themselves, especially in the South African context, but the inability or the inaccessibility to land tenure is that what's hindering them. Because currently they do build in the rural areas where they come from, but because they need to be closer to the place of work, they can't invest in a piece of land or bulk of earth that they don't own. I think, and if you don't have a title deed, another thing too, if you don't have a title deed, the government would never give you, or the banks or the banking sector will never allocate or give you any bonds or loans because you don't have any title deed to that piece of land.